Get out and never come back. You are nothing to this family. My mother's scream ripped through the tall ceilings of the historic brownstone I had quietly financed myself. Ethan lingered behind her, wearing that smug half grin, his $50,000 gambling debt hanging in the air like a silent accusation no one dared name. I didn't plead, I didn't break down. I met Susan's eyes, then looked at the brother I had financially carried for 10 years. Understood, I said. My voice was level, detached, almost surgical. I picked up my bag, stepped through the massive oak door, and let the sharp Chicago wind slice across my face. The lock snapped shut behind me, clean, decisive, irreversible. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I sat behind the wheel of my car, the engine murmuring softly against the frozen night. My hands rested at 10 and 2, perfectly still. The brownstone's porch light stayed on, spilling a dull yellow glow over the snow-covered steps. I waited for the collapse, for the tears, for the panic. For the reflex to run back and apologize for something I hadn't done. Nothing happened. Instead, a cold settled in my chest, mirroring the air outside. It wasn't painful, it was clarifying. For the first time in 29 years, the fog of obligation lifted, and the math finally made sense. I wasn't a disgraced daughter. I was a supplier whose contract had just been canceled. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up the dark interior of the car. Face ID unlocked it instantly. I ignored my messages, skipped my contacts. Went straight to my banking app. The blue icon pulsed, then my dashboard appeared. I scrolled past checking, past savings, down to scheduled transfers. There it was, the pulse sustaining my family's lifestyle. Family support, $3,850, set to go out on the first of every month. I stared at $3,850. That wasn't a mortgage, that was a luxury fee. That was the cost of belonging to a club that had just expelled me. For 10 years, I treated that transfer as immutable, like gravity, like time. I structured my entire financial life around not having that money. I worked 60-hour weeks managing global supply chains, streamlining routes, eliminating waste for billion-dollar corporations, yet somehow tolerated the most egregious inefficiency of all in my own finances. My mother's words echoed again. Get out. In logistics, when a client rejects a shipment, you don't argue, you return it. You liquidate inventory, you cut losses. They wanted me gone. Fine. Then my money was gone too. You don't evict the tenant and keep collecting rent. I tapped the transfer, expanded the details. Next payment 4 days. I selected edit, then cancel series. A small gray warning box appeared, asking if I was sure I wanted to delete the recurring transaction. I didn't flinch. My thumb hovered for a split second, not hesitation, just awareness. This was the most expensive click I'd ever make. Confirm. The line disappeared. The screen refreshed. Next month's projected balance jumped by nearly $4,000. It was shocking. That money was mine. It wasn't flowing into the brownstone. It wasn't funding Susan's appearances or Ethan's disasters. It was staying with me. I didn't text a warning. I didn't send a dramatic explanation. That would have been emotional. That would have opened the door to bargaining. And this wasn't a negotiation. It was execution of a severance agreement. I set the phone face down, shifted into drive, and pulled away from the curb. The brownstone vanished in the rearview mirror. Transaction complete. I checked into a downtown hotel, a tall, impersonal tower with gray carpeting and blackout curtains. I didn't unpack. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop. I needed data. In my world, feelings don't make decisions. Numbers do, and my life's numbers told a disturbing story. My tax returns list me as a senior logistics manager earning $145,000 annually. I oversee supply chains for medical equipment. I untangle high-stakes problems before most people finish breakfast, yet my checking account looked like it belonged to a struggling grad student. The apartment I'd just left was a 400-square-foot studio with second-hand furniture and leaky windows. I drove a 6-year-old sedan. I clipped coupons. I lived under strict austerity. Why? Because for 4 years, I'd been the sole liquidity provider for a failing operation called the Evans Family Brownstone. The house wasn't a home, it was a stage. Susan and Thomas didn't live there, they performed there. They hosted extravagant dinners to impress people they didn't even like. Ethan occupied the garden suite, a polite term for the basement. 33 years old, days spent building startups that never launched, nights spent gambling away whatever seed money appeared. They guarded him like a priceless asset. They treated me like a resource to be consumed. People loved to ask why I did it, why I paid nearly $4,000 a month while shrinking my own life. They call it weakness. That's lazy thinking. In logistics, we call it legacy system integration. When you're born inside a broken system, you don't recognize the flaws. It never started at $3,850. It started at 10 fetching wine because Susan was overwhelmed. At 16, working retail so I could buy my own clothes when Thomas had cash flow issues. They trained me, they conditioned me. My value equaled my usefulness. Useful meant safe, providing meant good. Love wasn't affection, it was a transaction, and I paid the bill, I normalized the cruelty. Accepted my role as fuel to keep Ethan warm, until tonight, the heat finally exceeded tolerance. The frog didn't jump, the frog shut the system down. On my spreadsheet, the silent investor column was empty for the first time in 4 years. I wasn't just saving money, I was reclaiming myself. They wanted the brownstone, they wanted the illusion. But they forgot the first rule of business. You don't fire the only person keeping the lights on. I closed the laptop. The hotel room's silence cost $200 a night. It was the first thing I'd bought purely for myself in years, and it was worth every dollar. Ethan is 33. While I spent my 20s earning certifications and negotiating contracts, he spent his finding himself in the basement. He calls himself an entrepreneur. His business cards list him as CEO of companies with no websites, no tax IDs, no revenue. 1 year it was crypto mining, tripled the electric bill. I paid it. Next came luxury dropshipping, ended with a garage full of junk. I paid to clear it out. My parents didn't see failure, they saw untapped genius. To Susan and Thomas, Ethan was a golden asset who just needed one more infusion of capital. I was the bond, stable, dull, dependable, there to absorb risk while they gambled. They defended his ego viciously. They dismissed my exhaustion casually. If I worked late, I lacked balance. If Ethan slept till noon, he was on a different schedule. The fight that ended my tenancy wasn't about chores or respect, it was about cash. Ethan had gone too far, online poker, sports betting, a sure thing that collapsed. He needed $50,000 to make a problem disappear before lawyers appeared. Susan presented it like a dinner plate. You have the money, Vanessa, fix this. For the first time, I said no. Bailouts are for assets with upside, not black holes. That's when the screaming began. That's when I was evicted. Certain exile would break me. They misjudged my tolerance for risk. 30 days passed. I moved from the hotel into a one-bedroom apartment in a glass tower 3 miles south. Clean, efficient, quiet. I bought furniture I chose, not heirlooms, not performances. Susan insisted we preserve. I bought a coffee maker that cost $300 and didn't feel a shred of guilt. Every morning I woke up, looked at the lake, and waited for my phone to ring, but it didn't. Day 5 passed, day 10, day 20. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't mysterious. I knew exactly why they hadn't called. In their minds, the transaction was still processing. They assumed that even though they had thrown me out, the auto pay was still active. They believed my desperation for their approval was a fixed contract term that couldn't be broken. They were sitting in their warm, historic home, waiting for the first of the month, secure in the knowledge that the silent investor would keep the lights on. They didn't know I had already liquidated the account. I wasn't hiding, I was just waiting for the invoice to bounce. Day 45, that is the magic number in mortgage logistics. The bank gives you a 15-day grace period, then they send a polite letter, then a stern letter, and then on day 45, the delinquency becomes official and the phone calls begin. I knew the timeline better than I knew my own birthday because I had spent 4 years ensuring we never hit that marker. But this morning, I was sitting in my office reviewing a shipping manifest for MRI machines when my personal phone lit up. It was Thomas. I didn't answer immediately. I let it ring 4 times, finishing my email. When I finally swiped, except there was no hello, there was only the sound of a man who had lost control of his narrative. "What did you do?" he screamed. His voice cracked high and thin. "The bank just called." The mortgage bounced. "They're saying we're delinquent. You're trying to ruin us, Vanessa. You're trying to destroy this family." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the city skyline. "I didn't do anything, Thomas," I said, my voice steady. "I simply stopped paying for a house I was evicted from. You told me to leave. I left. My money left with me. That was a heat-of-the-moment thing," he shouted. "We were fighting. Families fight, but you have a duty. You have an obligation. You can't just cut off the mortgage. That money is for the estate. It's for the legacy." He was gaslighting me in real time, trying to separate the abuse from the bill. He genuinely believed that my eviction was an emotional event, but my financial contribution was a contractual obligation that survived the termination of the relationship. Listening to him panic, I finally understood the mechanism at work. It wasn't just favoritism, it was economics, specifically the sunk cost fallacy. In business, the sunk cost fallacy is the tendency to continue throwing good money after bad because you have already invested so much that you cannot bear to admit the loss. My parents had spent 33 years investing in Ethan. They had poured their ego, their identity, and their reputation into the idea that their son was a genius entrepreneur. To hold him accountable now to demand he get a job or pay rent would be to admit that their entire investment strategy was a failure. It would destroy their own self-image. They couldn't fold the hand on Ethan, so they needed me to be the liquidity injection. I was the fresh capital keeping a bankrupt venture afloat. They weren't protecting him because they loved him more. They were protecting him because admitting he was a liability would mean admitting they were bad investors. They would rather burn me the profitable asset than admit the golden child was a loss. I am not your legacy insurance, I said into the phone, and I am not paying for a house where I am not welcome. If you need money, ask the person living in the garden suite. Ethan is building something, Thomas sputtered. He just needs time. You are selfish, Vanessa, you are cold. If we lose this house, it is on your head. No, I corrected him. It's on the deed, which doesn't have my name on it. I hung up. It was filled with the realization that they would truly rather lose everything than ask their son to pay a single dollar. They were committed to the crash. I didn't scream back. I didn't try to outshout a man who was drowning in his own panic. In my world, when a vendor fails to deliver, you don't argue with the sales rep, you audit the books. I told Thomas I would look into the account history, and I hung up. My voice was calm, the kind of calm that precedes a massive corporate restructuring. I opened my laptop. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment. This was the point of no return. I logged into the joint checking account, the operational account I had funded for 4 years. I still had the login credentials, a remnant of the days when I was expected to troubleshoot their technical issues because they weren't good with computers. The dashboard loaded. The balance was $200. I pulled up the transaction history for the last 10 months. I needed to trace the flow of capital. I knew my output, $4,500 a month. That was the agreed-upon sum, $3,850 for the mortgage, plus a surplus for property taxes and maintenance. It was a generous operating budget. The mortgage should have been on auto pay. The math should have been simple, but the ledger told a different story. I filtered the search. The mortgage payments had been sporadic for a year, then stopped completely 10 months ago, but I had kept sending the money. So where did $45,000 go? It hadn't evaporated. Money never disappears. It just changes hands. I scrolled through the withdrawals looking for the leak. I found it. It wasn't a leak. It was a fire hose. Starting 10 months ago, there were recurring transfers to Ethan Evans. 500 here, a TH000 there. But those were small potatoes compared to the line item that made my blood run cold. A massive down payment of $12,000 to Lakeshore Luxury Auto, followed by monthly payments of $900. I clicked on the check image for the down payment. In the memo line in my father's shaky handwriting were the words, Comp Vehicle Investment. I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, dark and jagged. It wasn't a company vehicle. Ethan didn't have a company, he didn't have clients, he didn't have a commute. I did a quick search on the dealership's inventory and cross-referenced the payment amount. It matched the financing terms for a fully loaded Obsidian black luxury pickup truck, a $65,000 toy for a man who lived in a basement. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just mismanaged the money. They hadn't just fallen behind because groceries were expensive. Thomas had taken the money I sent to save their home, the money I earned working 60-hour weeks, and he had diverted it to buy Ethan a status symbol. He had embezzled the mortgage payments to fund his son's cosplay as a successful businessman. They deemed the truck more essential than the roof over their heads. They gambled that I would never check the books, or that if I did, I would simply pay off the mortgage anyway to avoid the shame of foreclosure. They had stripped the equity from their own future to polish the ego of their golden child. This wasn't negligence, this was theft, and I had the receipts. The foreclosure notice arrived at the brownstone exactly 30 days after my audit. I know this because the bank also sent a copy to my old email address, a courtesy for the former financial contact. It was a formal eviction warning. They had 30 days to vacate. The legacy they claimed to protect was being liquidated. I didn't call to gloat. I didn't call to offer a lifeline. I just waited. 3 days later, security at my office building called my desk. Miss Evans, there are 2 individuals in the lobby asking for you. They say they're your parents. They're upset. I told the guard to let them wait. I finished my coffee. I reviewed a contract for a shipment of surgical steel. Then I took the elevator down. The lobby of my building is a cavern of marble and glass designed to make visitors feel small. Susan and Thomas looked microscopic. They were huddled on a leather bench, looking older than I had ever seen them. Susan was weeping into a tissue. Thomas was pale, his hands shaking in his lap. They weren't the imperious landlords who had screamed at me to get out. They were refugees of their own financial disaster. When they saw me, they scrambled up. Susan tried to rush forward, arms open, aiming for a hug that would erase the last 2 months. I stepped back, professional distance. Vanessa, she sobbed, thank God you have to help us. We're losing the legacy. We're losing the brownstone. We can't let strangers take our home, Thomas added, his voice trembling. For the sake of the family, for your brother, please just pay the Rs. Well, we'll make it right. They were still doing it. Even at the edge of the cliff, they were asking me to be the parachute for Ethan. They weren't sorry, they were just broke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lecture them about responsibility. I simply opened the manila folder I had brought down with me. You aren't losing the house because of me, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet lobby, and you aren't losing it because of bad luck. I handed Thomas the paper. It wasn't a check. It was a printout of the transaction history I had uncovered. Highlighted in neon yellow was the wire transfer to Lakeshore Luxury Auto, $65,000. The exact amount of equity they needed to save their home sitting on 4 rubber tires in the driveway. You embezzled my mortgage payments. I said, you took the money I sent to keep a roof over your heads, and you bought Ethan a truck for a business that doesn't exist. You didn't prioritize the legacy. You prioritized his ego. Thomas stared at the paper. His face turned a shade of gray that matched the stone floor. Susan stopped crying and froze. They looked at the evidence of their own theft, stripped of all the family rhetoric they used to hide it. I can't save you, I said, stepping back toward the security gates. Because I don't have that money anymore. Ethan has it. Maybe he can sell the truck. Vanessa, wait, Susan wailed, realizing the meeting was over. I turned back one last time. You told me to get out. I did, now you have to get out too. I swiped my badge. The glass gates opened. I walked through them and didn't look back. The foreclosure auction took place 90 days after I walked out of the lobby. I didn't attend. I didn't need to see the gavel fall to know the asset had been liquidated. The brownstones sold for just enough to cover the bank's lien and the outstanding tax bill. There was no equity left over. My parents moved into a 2-bedroom rental apartment in a suburb 45 minutes away. It has low ceilings, laminate countertops, and thin walls. They hate it. Ethan's luxury truck was repossessed 3 weeks later. Without the embezzled funds from the mortgage account, he couldn't make a single payment. He is back to taking the bus. The CEO is now working part-time at a warehouse, a job Thomas forced him to take to pay their new rent. The reality check was brutal, but it was necessary. I haven't spoken to them since that day in the lobby. I blocked their numbers, their emails, and their social media accounts. I didn't do it to punish them. I did it to protect the new ecosystem I was building. There is a misconception about going no contact. People tell you it is an act of war. They tell you that you are cold, that you are unforgiving, that family is the most important asset you possess, but they are wrong. Family is a system, and sometimes that system is designed to consume you. If you are standing on that edge right now wondering if you are too harsh for walking away, listen to me. You are not losing a family, you are surviving one, you are not abandoning them, you are saving yourself. The guilt you feel is just the programming they installed to keep you compliant. It is the error code they wrote into your software to stop you from uninstalling the malware. Peace is expensive. It cost me a historic home. It cost me the illusion of having parents who loved me. It cost me the comfort of the familiar. But as I sit here in my own apartment drinking coffee that I paid for, looking out at a view that belongs only to me, I look at the balance sheet of my life. I have silence, I have dignity. I have a future that isn't being mortgaged to pay for someone else's mistakes. Peace is expensive, but looking at the ledger now, I can tell you this. It is worth every single penny. If you've ever had to pay the price for your own peace, share this story. You aren't alone.